You're standing in the middle of a road you don't recognize, somewhere in Europe or the Pacific. You've lost track of which country you're in. You've been in this war for 3 years, maybe 4. And then, from somewhere behind you, you hear someone yell. Not a warning, not an order, something else. It's over! The war is over! And you have absolutely no idea how to feel about that. Here's the thing nobody tells you about the end of a war. You've spent years preparing to fight, move, survive, repeat. You wake up before dawn. You dig, you wait, you move, you shoot. You don't plan next week. You plan the next 10 minutes. Your entire brain has been rewired around one question. Am I going to make it through today? And then one day, someone tells you that question is gone. And your brain doesn't know what to do with that. This is a story about what actually happened inside the minds and bodies of soldiers on VE Day, May 8th, 1945, and VJ Day, August 15th, 1945. Not the ticker tape parades you've seen in photos. The other part. The part they didn't photograph. The part that lived inside the guys standing in those crowds, wondering why they weren't feeling what they thought they'd feel. These men went to war as teenagers and young adults. The average age of a U.S. combat soldier in World War II was 26. Some were 18, some were 19. They were kids who had been handed a rifle and told the fate of the world depended on them. And on this one specific day, that job was done. So now what? Here's something the history books compress into a single moment that wasn't a single moment at all. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the war in Europe was over, but the war in the Pacific, still happening, full speed. For the 1.5 million American soldiers still fighting in the Pacific, VE Day was news from a different world. For them, the war had 3 more months. 3 more months of island hopping, of Okinawa, of casualty rates that would make your stomach drop. And then, August 6th, Hiroshima. August 9th, Nagasaki. August 15th, 1945, Japan announces surrender. Private First Class Paul Fussell was on a troop transport ship headed toward the planned invasion of Japan. He later wrote that the atomic bomb, as horrific as it was, felt like a lottery win to the men on that ship, because they knew what the invasion would have cost. Military estimates at the time projected over 1 million American casualties in a ground invasion. They were next. And then, they weren't. That moment when something terrible that was definitely going to happen simply didn't happen produces a very specific kind of relief. It's not the same as joy. It's closer to disbelief, like your body is waiting for the catch.
Let's get into what was actually happening inside these men's bodies, because this isn't just history, it's basic neuroscience. When you're in a war zone for an extended period, your brain undergoes measurable physical changes. The amygdala, the part of your brain that handles threat response, gets stronger, more reactive, faster. The prefrontal cortex, the part that handles long-term planning, emotional regulation, calm decision-making, gets quieter. Your brain literally restructures around survival. So when peace came, suddenly, the brain didn't just switch back. You can't unlearn a threat response in an afternoon. Veterans described being startled by car backfires, by loud crowds, by a door slamming. Not because they were weak, because their brains had literally changed shape around the environment they'd been living in. The war ended on paper. The brain hadn't gotten the memo yet. There's also the cortisol crash. Cortisol is your stress hormone. In combat, your body produces it constantly. It keeps you sharp, vigilant, alive. But chronic cortisol elevation has a price. Your immune system takes hits, your digestion gets disrupted, your sleep gets wrecked. When peace came, cortisol levels didn't just normalize, they dropped fast. A lot of veterans describe the first weeks of peace as a kind of total physical shutdown, exhaustion unlike anything they'd felt during the war itself. Their body finally allowed itself to be tired. There's also this, survivor's guilt. Not as a vague concept, as a specific crushing weight that settled onto men who watched their friends die and couldn't explain why they were still breathing. The randomness of war is one of the most psychologically destabilizing things a human can experience. You didn't survive because you were smarter or better or more deserving. You survived because a bullet hit 3 inches to the left of you instead of 3 inches to the right. The guy next to you wasn't as lucky. How do you celebrate that?
You've probably seen the photograph.
The Sailor, Times Square, August 14th, 1945. It is the image of World War II ending. But here's what the photograph can't show you: how most of those men got to Times Square. They didn't drive in from the suburbs. They didn't come from offices. Many of them came from ships docking in New York Harbor after years in the Pacific. They had been in the water for weeks. They were thin, some were sick. Some of them were stepping onto American soil for the first time in years. And the reaction, even in the middle of the biggest party this country had ever thrown, was complicated. One Marine described it this way: "I thought I'd feel like Superman. Instead, I felt like a stranger in a city that had kept moving without me." That's the thing about extended absence from normal life. The world doesn't pause while you're gone. Your city kept running, your family kept aging, your street got a new stop sign. Small things, but they added up to a version of home that didn't match the one you'd been imagining. There's a psychological concept called re-entry shock. It's what happens when someone who's been in an extreme environment, a war, a prison, a remote expedition, tries to reintegrate into ordinary life. The contrast can actually trigger a grief response, because ordinary life, the mundane, the routine, the what do you want for dinner conversations, can feel almost insultingly small. When you've spent years operating in a world of life and death, someone's complaint about the wrong coffee order feels like a different language.
Here's something most people don't know about VJ Day. Japan surrendered on August 15th, 1945. But for hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, the war wasn't over. They were now occupation forces, stationed in Japan, in the Philippines, in Okinawa, doing not combat, but something stranger: policing a country they'd just been trying to destroy. Private Eugene Sledge, who fought at Peleliu and Okinawa, two of the bloodiest battles in the Pacific, wrote about standing in Japan after the surrender and trying to reconcile what he was seeing with what he'd been through. The same country, the same people, but now his job was to help rebuild it. That kind of cognitive reversal takes time. Most of these men didn't get home until months, sometimes over a year after VJ Day. The Army used a point system to determine who went home first. If you'd been in the Pacific for 4 years, you might get home by Christmas. If you'd arrived more recently, you might not see your family until spring of 1946. Some of those men in occupation duty wrote home letters that their families described as strange, flat, affectless, like someone writing a report instead of a letter. Because for a lot of these men, the emotional volume had been turned way down. Not by choice, by necessity. You can't feel everything in combat and survive. So the mind builds walls, efficient, functional, protective walls. And then peace comes, and the walls are still there, and you don't necessarily know how to take them down.
Here's the reframe. You've probably heard the term the greatest generation. It was coined by journalist Tom Brokaw to describe Americans who lived through the Depression and fought World War II. And in many ways, they were remarkable, full stop. But here's what that framing accidentally did. It flattened their experience into a narrative of pure heroism and resilience. It made their suffering look clean. The men who came home in 1945 and 1946 largely did not talk about what they'd been through. That silence was often interpreted as stoicism, as strength. But a lot of those men weren't silent because they were strong. They were silent because there was no framework for them to speak. PTSD wasn't a diagnosis. It was called shell shock or battle fatigue, and it was often treated as weakness. Asking for help wasn't the culture, so they took it home and buried it. And their families, who were so relieved to have them back, often didn't ask because they didn't know how to ask, because nobody had told them there was something to ask about. The greatest generation wasn't great because they felt nothing. They were great because they kept moving, even when the weight was crushing. But keeping moving had a cost, and that cost showed up in their children, in emotional distance, in volatility, in families who loved each other and couldn't explain why they couldn't really talk. The war didn't end in 1945. Not entirely. It just moved indoors.
So why does any of this matter to you? You're watching this in a room that's not a foxhole. The biggest threat you faced this week was probably a deadline or a bad text exchange. So what does a soldier standing in a road in 1945 have to do with you? Here's what. Every generation inherits the psychological residue of the one before it. The emotional patterns your parents modeled, they learned those from their parents, who learned them from theirs. A lot of the emotional coping patterns that still run through American families, the don't talk about it, the push through, the you should be grateful, have roots that stretch back to men standing in roads just like this one. Not as blame, just as context. Because context is how you stop repeating patterns. There's a concept in psychology called post-traumatic growth. The idea that trauma, processed, understood, and eventually integrated, can actually expand a person, make them more empathetic, more resilient, more present. The key word is processed. The guys who came home in 1945 largely didn't get the chance to process. They were told to move on. And they did, because that's what the culture asked of them. But what if someone had handed them a framework, a language for what they'd experienced? We'll never know, but we can think about what that would have changed. The men who stood in those roads on May 8th and August 15th were not superhumans. They were not immune to fear or grief or confusion. They were 22-year-old kids who had been handed an impossible situation and had survived it. And when it ended, most of them didn't feel triumphant. They felt empty, grateful, guilty, relieved, lost, homesick for a version of home that didn't exist anymore. All at once, simultaneously, no instruction manual. And yet, they moved forward anyway. They built families, built suburbs, built an economy. Some of them built things that lasted. Some of them passed the weight down. Most of them did both, because that's what people do. They carry what they can and put down what they can't, and call it a life. You're standing in the middle of a road you don't recognize. The war just ended. You don't know how to feel about that.